Barron Trump, the enigmatic giant of America's most polarizing dynasty, walked into a bookstore expecting nothing more than a quiet escape, only to stumble into the most outrageous, heart-pounding showdown imaginable. What happened was so astonishing, so hilariously unhinged, that it's already being whispered as the greatest clash of wills ever witnessed in a place meant for peace. A Zelensky fan, fierce, unyielding, and armed with a burning cause, hijacked Barron's serene afternoon, turning it into a raging spectacle that left jaws on the floor and the nation in a frenzy. This wasn't just a moment. It was a wildfire of controversy, a collision so electric it'll have you on the edge of your seat, desperate to know how it all unfolds. The bookstore, nestled on a quiet street in Washington, D.C., was a refuge carved from time itself. Its towering shelves loomed like sentinels, laden with volumes of history, politics, and forgotten lore, their spines cracked and faded under the weight of years. Dim light filtered through tall, dusty windows, casting golden pools across the hardwood floor, worn smooth by decades of silent footsteps. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged leather and ink, a faint undertone of coffee drifting from a small counter where a barista polished a steaming machine, her movements slow and deliberate. The space hummed with a stillness so deep it felt alive, a sanctuary where the chaos of the outside world dissolved into whispers of turning pages and the soft creak of settling wood. Barron Trump stepped across the threshold, his 6'7" frame filling the doorway, a shadow against the afternoon glow. Clad in a black hoodie pulled low over his brow and jeans that hugged his lean legs, he moved with a predator's grace, his presence both commanding and discreet. His piercing blue eyes, sharp as cut glass, swept the room, taking in its quiet rhythm. Barron was no stranger to scrutiny. His name alone carried a storm of expectation. But here, among the books, he sought something rare: solitude. His long fingers brushed the edge of a shelf as he ventured deeper, drawn to a section on Cold War espionage, a subject that had lately consumed his private hours. The weight of a... This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. The store was sparsely populated, its few occupants lost in their own orbits. An old man lingered near the philosophy stacks, his gnarled hands tracing the titles with reverence, his glasses slipping down his nose. A college student sprawled in an armchair, her legs draped over the side. A thick biography splayed across her lap, her coffee cooling on a nearby table. The barista's soft humming floated through the air, a melody barely audible over the rustle of paper. Barron blended into this tapestry as best he could, his height the only ripple in the calm, though even that seemed to shrink in the store's enveloping hush. He pulled a heavy tome from the shelf, a study of covert operations, and settled into a corner, his broad shoulders hunching slightly as he flipped through its pages, his focus narrowing to the maps and coded messages within. But the stillness was deceptive, a fragile veneer stretched thin by an unseen presence. Near the front, beside a display of international bestsellers, a figure stood motionless, his wiry frame taut with intent. He wore a dark jacket, its collar turned up, a small Ukrainian flag pin gleaming on his chest like a beacon. His name was Alexei, though his online followers knew him as Kyiv's voice, a relentless activist whose digital footprint was a battlefield of manifestos and outrage. His dark eyes, sunken from sleepless nights, locked onto Barron with a hunter's precision. For weeks, he had tracked the young Trump's rare public outings, fueled by a conviction that the family's legacy mocked the struggles of nations like Ukraine. Today, he had followed Barron here, his heart pounding with the thrill of opportunity, his mind alight with a plan to turn this quiet haven into a stage. Alexei's hand dipped into his pocket, retrieving a smartphone, its screen scratched from countless protests. His thumb activated the camera, and within moments he was live streaming, his movements subtle but deliberate, his breath shallow with anticipation. The view count climbed steadily as his followers, zealous, scattered across continents, tuned in, sensing the storm brewing in his silence. He edged forward, his boots scuffing the floor, the sound a faint intrusion in the bookstore's peace. The elderly man glanced up, his brow furrowing at the phone's glow, but he retreated deeper into the stacks, unwilling to engage. The student shifted in her chair, her eyes flickering toward Alexei, then back to her book, a thread of unease tugging at her focus. Barron remained oblivious, his attention buried in the book, his finger tracing a line about a decades-old espionage scandal. The weight of the volume steadied him, its dense prose a shield against the world he perpetually navigated. Yet the air around him thickened, a subtle shift he felt in his bones, the prickle of being watched, the instinct honed by years under a microscope. His head tilted slightly, his blonde hair catching the light, but he didn't lift his gaze, not yet. The store's serenity began to unravel, thread by thread, as Alexei closed the distance, his phone held high, its lens drinking in every detail of Barron's unsuspecting form. The barista paused, her rag hovering over the counter, her humming silenced by the growing tension she couldn't name. The student closed her book, her posture stiffening as she watched Alexei's approach, her coffee forgotten. The old man disappeared entirely, swallowed by the labyrinth of shelves, leaving the scene to unfold unchecked. Alexei stopped a few paces from Barron, his chest rising and falling with quick, sharp breaths, his eyes blazing with purpose. The live stream's audience swelled, comments flashing across the screen, predictions, taunts, cheers, each one feeding the activist's resolve. He raised the phone higher, its light casting a faint glow across Barron's hoodie, a spotlight in the dimness. Barron sensed it then, the weight of scrutiny, the shift from solitude to exposure. He set the book down, his movements slow and measured, the heavy thud of its cover against the table a quiet drumbeat in the stillness. His eyes lifted, locking onto Alexei's, blue meeting brown in a collision of wills that needed no words. The activist's face flushed, his jaw tightening, his fervor a tangible force pulsing between them. Barron's expression remained a fortress, cool, unreadable, his sharp features carved from stone, but beneath it a flicker of recognition stirred. He knew this wasn't random, this was personal, pointed, a challenge wrapped in the guise of chance. The air crackled, thick with the promise of chaos, the bookstore's peace shattering like glass underfoot. Alexei took a step closer, his phone trembling slightly in his grip, the live stream capturing the moment the sanctuary became a battleground. Barron rose to his full height, his shadow stretching across the floor, a towering figure against the activist's wiry defiance. The student shrank back in her chair, the barista froze, and the shelves themselves seemed to lean in, witnesses to a storm about to break. Whatever came next, it was clear. Barron Trump's quiet afternoon was over, and the Zelensky fan had just lit the fuse. The bookstore's glass door swung shut behind Barron Trump, the faint jingle of the bell swallowed by the clamor of the street outside. Flashing red and blue lights painted the pavement as two police officers pushed through the gathering crowd, their radios crackling with static. Barron pulled his hoodie tighter around his face, his tall frame cutting through the onlookers like a blade through water. His breath steadied, but his mind churned. Each step away from the chaos replayed the confrontation in sharp fragments. Alexei's wild eyes, the sting of his accusations, the weight of a dozen phones capturing every move. He knew this wasn't just a scuffle in a bookstore anymore. It was a spark, and the dry tinder of the internet was already catching fire. Inside, Alexei knelt on the hardwood floor, his cracked phone cradled in his hands like a fallen soldier. The screen flickered faintly, its shattered glass reflecting the overhead lights in jagged streaks. His chest heaved, his breaths ragged, as the weight of his unraveling crusade pressed down on him. The elderly man hovered nearby, clutching a worn copy of War and Peace, his expression a mix of pity and disapproval. The student, still filming, angled her phone to catch Alexei's defeat, her lips parted in silent awe. The barista, phone still pressed to her ear, whispered updates to the dispatcher, her voice trembling as she glanced at the officers stepping through the door. "Hands where we can see them," the first officer barked, his tone clipped but calm. He was broad-shouldered, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights, his partner, a wiry woman with sharp eyes, flanking him with a hand resting on her holster. Alexei didn't resist. He raised his hand slowly, the phone slipping from his grip to clatter against the floor once more. His Ukrainian flag pin caught the light as he stood, a small beacon of defiance amid his surrender. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to the officers. The crowd outside pressed against the windows, their phones held high, turning the bookstore into a fishbowl of scrutiny. The officers exchanged a glance, the woman stepping forward to cuff Alexei's wrists with practiced efficiency. "You're coming with us," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Disturbing the peace, possible assault, let's sort it out at the station." Alexei's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a flicker of his earlier fire. "Assault," he spat. "He's the one who should be in cuffs, Barron Trump, walking away like he's untouchable." The officer didn't respond, guiding him toward the door as the barista stepped aside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Outside, the crowd parted reluctantly, their murmurs rising into a low roar. "That's the Zelensky guy," someone shouted, their phone thrust forward to catch Alexei's exit. "Where, Barron?" another voice called, craning to spot the towering figure already vanishing down the street. The footage from the bookstore, Barron's stoic deflection, Alexei's shattered phone, had already splintered across platforms, each clip spawning threads of outrage, memes, and hot takes. Bookstore brawl trended within minutes, followed by Barron vs Zelensky fan, the hashtag stitching together a narrative that shifted with every retweet. Barron turned a corner, the sirens fatting behind him, the city's hum swallowing his footsteps. He slipped into a narrow alley, leaning against the brick wall to catch his breath. His hands flexed at his sides, the memory of Alexei's wrist in his grip still tingling in his fingers. He wasn't shaken, not exactly, but the encounter had cracked something open, a fault line in the armor he'd built around himself. His family's name was a shadow he couldn't outrun, a legacy that painted a target on his back whether he embraced it or not. "I'm not my father," he'd said, and he meant it, but the world didn't care about distinctions. To Alexei, to the crowd, to the faceless masses online, he was a Trump, and that was enough. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with notifications, texts from friends, alerts from news apps. A flood of mentions on X, a video thumbnail caught his eye. Him swatting Alexei's phone, the moment frozen in grainy clarity, already racking up thousands of views. He didn't play it. He didn't need to. The comments would be a war zone, half calling him a hero for keeping his cool, half branding him a villain for the sins of his lineage. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, his jaw tightening. This wasn't his fight, but it had found him anyway. Back at the bookstore, the officers loaded Alexei into the squad car, its door slamming shut with a dull thud. The crowd lingered, reluctant to let the spectacle end, their phones still rolling as the car pulled away. Inside, the barista sank into a chair, her hands shaking as she rubbed her temples. The elderly man returned to his book, though his eyes kept darting to the door, while the student uploaded her footage with a caption, "Caught this live, insane." The shelves stood silent, their books untouched witnesses to the storm that had passed through. Alexei stared out the squad car's window, his cuffed hands resting in his lap. His mind raced, replaying every word, every move. He wanted to expose Barron, to make the world see the cost of power and privilege, but the cracked phone at his feet told a different story, a story of his own defeat. Yet even now, his resolve hardened. This wasn't the end. The live stream might be dead, but the cause was. He thought of his aunt's tear-streaked letters from Kiev, the cousins he'd lost to the war, memories that fueled his rage and kept it burning. Barron might have walked away, but the fight would follow him. The car turned onto a busy street, the city lights blurring past, and Alexei's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. The world had seen it, millions maybe by now, and that was something. The footage was out there, raw and unfiltered, a match struck in the dark. He'd lost the battle, but the war was just beginning. Barron, meanwhile, emerged from the alley, his stride purposeful as he blended into the evening crowd. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders, heavier than he'd expected. He knew the viral storm was only growing, that tomorrow's headlines would dissect every frame, every word. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, "Keep your head down, Barron. They'll always come for us." But keeping his head down hadn't worked this time. Alexei had forced him into the light, and there was no retreating from it now. Ahead, a newsstand glowed under a street lamp, its screens flashing breaking news. Barron Trump in bookstore clash with activist, video goes viral. He paused, his reflection caught in the glass, a tall silhouette against the chaos of the world. The fuse had ignited and the explosion was coming, whether he was ready or not. The city's pulse thrummed around Barron as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool evening air brushing against his face like a fleeting reprieve. Neon signs flickered above, casting jagged reflections on the pavement, while the distant hum of traffic blended with the murmur of passers-by. He pulled his hood tighter, hoping to melt into the anonymity of the urban sprawl, but the weight of the bookstore encounter clung to him, a shadow he couldn't outpace. The Zelensky fan's words echoed in his skull. "This isn't over." Barron's fists clenched inside his pockets. He wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to the ravings of a zealot, but something gnawed at him, a sense that the man's desperation was a mirror held up to his own carefully guarded uncertainties. Behind him, the bookstore's glass doors burst open with a jarring clang. Barron didn't need to turn to know who it was. The Zelensky fan stormed out, his boots pounding the concrete, his voice cutting through the evening clamor like a blade. "You think you can just slink away, Trump? Hide behind your name and your silence?" The accusation drew eyes. Pedestrians slowed, their phones emerging like vultures circling a fresh kill. Barron's shoulders tensed, his stride quickening, but the fan matched his pace, relentless. "I told you," the fan shouted, his breath ragged with exertion and fury. "The world's going to hear about this. My cousin's in Kiev right now, hiding in a basement because your country's too busy playing politics to help. You think that's nothing to you. You think that's just noise." Barron stopped abruptly, the words slamming into him like a physical blow. He turned, facing the fan whose flushed face glistened under the streetlights. The man's chest heaved, his hands trembling, not just with anger, Barron realized, but with a raw, visceral pain. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and electric, broken only by the faint buzz of a nearby street lamp. "I'm sorry about your cousin," Barron said finally, his voice softer than he'd intended, threaded with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "I mean that, but what do you want from me? I'm not the president, I'm not a senator, I'm just me." The fan's eyes widened, caught off guard by the response, but the flicker of vulnerability vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Just you," he spat, stepping closer, his voice rising. "You're a Trump. Your family's fingerprints are all over this mess, decades of influence, decades of decisions. You don't get to play the just me card when people are dying." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered defenses of Barron, their voices a chaotic chorus. Phones were aloft now, red recording lights blinking, capturing every word, every gesture. Barron felt the heat of their scrutiny, a spotlight he'd spent his life dodging. His pulse quickened, a drumbeat of frustration and defiance swelling in his chest. "You want to blame me for everything," he snapped, his restraint fraying. "Fine, but what's your plan, huh? Yelling at me on a street corner, how that's saving your cousin? How's that fixing anything?" His voice rose, sharp and unyielding, the words spilling out before he could rein them in. "Maybe instead of screaming about what my family hasn't done, you should ask why your precious Zelensky hasn't won this war yet." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air from the scene. The Zelensky fan froze, his face a mask of shock and outrage as if Barron had struck him. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stall, then chaos erupted. The fan lunged forward, not with fists, but with a roar, "You arrogant little," before he could finish. Two figures shoved through the onlookers, burly men in dark jackets, earpieces glinting. Barron's security detail materializing as if summoned by the escalating tension. "Step back, sir," one of them barked, planting himself between Barron and the fan. The other gripped the fan's arm, pulling him away as he thrashed, shouting, He doesn't get it. None of them do. The crowd surged, some yelling support for the fan, others jeering at Barron, their voices a tangled mess of outrage and excitement. Barron stood rooted, his breath shallow, watching as the fan was dragged back toward the bookstore. The man's eyes locked onto his, blazing with a promise of retribution. "This goes online tonight," he snarled, wrestling against the grip of the guards. "Every word you said, everyone's going to see it." Security team turned to Barron, one of them muttering, "We need to get you out of here now." But before they could hustle him away, a new sound pierced the din, a sharp, deliberate clap, slow and mocking. Barron's gaze snapped to its source. A man leaning against a lamppost, his face half-shadowed by a fedora, a smirk playing on his lips. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a weathered look that suggested he'd seen more than his share of chaos. The crowd quieted, drawn to the stranger's sudden presence. "Quite the performance, kid," the man said, his voice gravelly, carrying an edge of amusement. "But you just handed him a megaphone. Hope you're ready for the fallout." He tipped his hat slightly, revealing a glint in his eye that felt both knowing and dangerous, then melted back into the throng as if he'd never been there. Barron's stomach twisted, the stranger's words sinking in. He glanced at the phone still pointed at him, their lenses unblinking, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The security team urged him toward a waiting car, but his feet moved slowly, his mind racing. What had he done? That throwaway line about Zelensky, meant as a jab, a deflection, had ignited something he couldn't control. The fan's threat echoed louder now. Everyone's going to see it. As the car door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in the muffled safety of tinted windows, Barron leaned back, closing his eyes. The engine purred to life, but the silence inside felt suffocating. He could already imagine the headlines, the viral clips, the storm of outrage and counter-outrage that would follow. And that man, the stranger with the hat, what did he know? Who was he? Outside, the city blurred past, indifferent to the tempest brewing in its midst. But for Barron, there was no escaping it. The confrontation wasn't over, it had just begun to spiral into something bigger, something he wasn't sure he could handle. And as the car sped into the night, one question gnawed at him. What would happen when the world woke up to his words? The wind howled outside the Trump estate, a restless sound that mirrored the turmoil churning in Barron's chest. He sat slouched in the leather armchair, his phone glowing in his hand like a beacon he couldn't ignore. The latest news alert stared back at him. Zelensky fan to give exclusive interview, claims Barron Trump mocked Ukraine's struggle. His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing as he reread the headline. The words twisted in his mind, reshaping his impulsive street-side retort into something uglier, something he hadn't meant, or had he? The doubt gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. He tossed the phone onto the cushion beside him, the screen still alight with notifications that buzzed like flies circling a wound. Standing, he crossed the foyer to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The estate's grounds stretched out before him, dark and silent under the night sky, a fortress against the chaos beyond the gates. But the chaos had found him anyway, seeping through the cracks of his carefully guarded life. Barron's reflection stared back at him, his sharp features softened by the dim light, his father's jawline, his mother's piercing eyes. He'd spent years dodging the spotlight, letting his family's larger-than-life shadows shield him. But tonight, that shield had cracked. The Zelensky fan, Dmitry, the headlines called him, had thrust him into the arena, and now the world was baying for blood. His blood. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time it was a text from his older brother, Don Jr. "You stepped in it, kid. Dad's pissed, but he's proud too. Call me." Barron's lips twitched, a ghost of a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Of course his father was proud, controversy was the family currency, minted and traded with relish. But the pride felt hollow, overshadowed by the mess he'd made. He turned away from the window, his gaze landing on the framed photo on the mantel. His family in happier times, all smiles and unity, before the world had turned so vicious. Barron's chest tightened. He didn't want to be another burden, another headline for them to spin. But retreat wasn't an option. not when Dimitri's interview loomed like a guillotine, ready to drop and sever whatever control he had left. Meanwhile, across town, Dimitri's cramped apartment buzzed with a different kind of energy. The journalist from Channel 5, a wiry woman named Lara with a sharp bob and sharper eyes, perched on the edge of his sagging couch, her recorder whirring softly between them. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and laundry detergent from the shop below, a stark contrast to the polished chaos of the Trump estate. Dimitri sat opposite her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his cracked phone discarded on the desk behind him. "So, Dimitri," Lara began, her voice smooth but probing, "tell me about today. What pushed you to confront Barron Trump?" Dimitri's eyes flickered, a storm brewing behind them. He took a slow breath, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "It wasn't planned," he said, his voice low, accented with the faint edges of his Ukrainian roots. "I was there outside that event, holding my sign, 'Support Ukraine, Stop the War.' I've been doing it for months, shouting into the wind. No one listens. Then he walked out, Barron Trump, this symbol of everything I hate. Wealth, power, indifference." Lara leaned forward, her pen tapping against her notebook. "And what he said about Zelensky, about the war, how did that hit you?" Dimitri's hands unclenched, his fingers curling into fists again as the memory flared. "He mocked us," he said, his voice rising. "He stood there, safe in his bubble, and asked why Zelensky hasn't won, like it's a game, like my cousin in Kiev isn't hiding from bombs every night, like my people aren't dying while his family tweets and golfs." The words spilled out, raw and jagged, and Lara scribbled furiously, her eyes gleaming with the scent of a story. Dimitri paused, catching his breath, his gaze dropping to the floor. He hadn't meant to say so much, but the dam had broken and the flood was unstoppable. "And now," Lara pressed, "the video's everywhere, people are calling you a hero or a fool. What's your next move?" Dimitri lifted his head, his jaw set. "I don't care what they call me," he said. "This isn't about me, it's about Ukraine. If Barron Trump's words can get people talking, then I'll use that. I'll make them listen." Lara nodded, snapping her notebook shut. "This airs tomorrow morning," she said, standing. "Be ready, the spotlight on you now." She left as quickly as she'd come, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving Dimitri alone with the hum of his laptop and the weight of his own resolve. He stood, crossing to the window, the city lights blurring into streaks beyond the grimy glass. The interview was a gamble, a megaphone he'd wrested from Barron's careless hands. But it was also a risk. Every word he'd spoken would be picked apart, weaponized by supporters and detractors alike. He thought of the stranger in the crowd, the one who'd clapped and warned Barron of the fallout. Whoever he was, he'd been right. The megaphone was his now, and Dimitri intended to use it. Back at the estate, Barron paced the foyer, his footsteps a restless rhythm against the marble. The news alert about Dimitri's interview burned in his mind, each imagined accusation tightening the knot in his stomach. He stopped, running a hand through his hair, and grabbed his phone again. The video's view count had climbed past 3 million, the comments a roaring tide of praise and vitriol. He scrolled through them, unable to look away. "Barron's right, Zelensky's a failure," one read. "Spoiled brat needs to shut up about things he doesn't understand," another countered. A third caught his eye, posted just minutes ago. "Watch your back, Barron, the streets don't forget." The words sent a chill down his spine, the anonymity of the threat sharpening its edge. The front door creaked open behind him and Barron spun around, his pulse spiking. It was only his mother, Melania, her heels clicking softly as she stepped inside, her coat draped over one arm. Her face was calm, but her eyes, those eyes he'd inherited, held a storm of their own. "Barron," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I saw the news. Are you all right?" He nodded, though the lie sat heavy on his tongue. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a shrug. "It's just noise." Melania set her coat down, crossing to him with a grace that belied the tension in her posture. "It's never just noise," she said, resting a hand on his arm. "Not for us, but you're strong. We'll get through this together." Her words were a lifeline, but they didn't erase the uncertainty clawing at him. "He's doing an interview," Barron said, his voice low. "The Zelensky guy. It's airing tomorrow." Melania's lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of anger crossing her face. "Let him talk," she said. "The more he says, the more he'll trip over himself. We'll handle the rest." Barron wanted to believe her, to let the family machine take over and grind this mess into dust. But as she squeezed his arm and turned to head upstairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was his fight now, not his father, not his mother. His. He sank back into the chair, the phone slipping from his hand to the floor with a soft thud. The wind outside grew louder, a wild howl that seemed to carry the voices of the internet, the streets, the war-torn world beyond his gates. Dmitri's interview loomed on the horizon, a shadow growing larger with every tick of the clock. And somewhere in the city, a stranger watched, clapping silently as the stage was set for the next act. Barron closed his eyes, the question echoing in the dark, fight or fade. He had until morning to decide. The morning sun crept through the heavy drapes of the Trump estate, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Barron sat at the breakfast table, his untouched coffee cooling beside him, his eyes glued to his phone as the view count on Dmitri's video surged past 5 million. Each refresh unleashed a flood of comments, some hurling insults, others cheering him on, but all tearing into his life with relentless fervor. Barron Trump, Zelensky jab sparks global outrage, screamed the latest headline from the Daily Blaze. His stomach twisted, anger and defiance warring within him as the numbers climbed. His mother's heels clicked against the floor as Melania entered, her face composed but her eyes flickering with worry. She placed a tablet in front of him, displaying a draft statement from the family's PR team, an apology dripping with diplomatic polish, ready to bear his signature. "I deeply regret any offense caused." Barron skimmed it, then shoved the tablet aside, his jaw tightening. "I'm not saying that," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I didn't mock anyone. I was defending myself." Melania sighed, settling into the chair beside him. "Barron, this isn't about what you meant. It's about what they think you meant. The world's watching, and they won't stop until you give them something." He shook his head, fingers tapping the table in restless rhythm. "They want blood, Mom. An apology won't fix it, it'll just make them hungrier." His eyes darted back to his phone as a new notification flashed. Dmitri was going live at noon, titled "The Fight Continues. Barron Trump Must Answer." A chill prickled down his spine. Melania's lips thinned as she noticed the screen. "He's not going to stop," she murmured. "Men like him thrive on this. You need to be careful." Barron shot to his feet, the chair screeching against the marble. "I am careful," he snapped, then softened, dragging a hand through his hair. "But I'm not hiding. If he wants a fight, he'll get one." Her gaze sharpened, maternal instinct edging her tone. "This isn't a game, Barron. Your father's enemies will use you to hurt him. Don't give them more to work with." He met her eyes, a spark of rebellion flaring. "I'm not Dad," he said firmly. "I'm not playing their rules. If they want to twist what I said, fine. But I'm not sorry for something I didn't do." Melania's expression softened, a faint pride breaking through her concern. She squeezed his hand. "Then be smart," she said. "Don't let him bait you again." He nodded, but her words weighed on him like a stone. She was right. Dmitri was unpredictable, a fuse already lit. Backing down felt like defeat, though, and that gnawed at him more than the headlines. Meanwhile, across the city, Dmitri's cramped apartment hummed with chaotic energy. His laptop glowed with the live stream setup, the chat already alive with followers typing in a frenzy of excitement and anger. He paced the room, boots scuffing the threadbare carpet, mentally rehearsing the fire he'd soon spit into the mic. His cracked phone sat on the desk, a memento of the Bookstore clash with Barron, its shattered screen a badge of his resolve. He paused, staring at the Ukrainian flag tacked to the wall, its blue and yellow weathered but defiant. Beneath it lay his cousin's last letter, folded and worn from rereading. "We're still here, Dima, still fighting." Those words were his fuel, a reminder that this wasn't just about Barron, it was about Ukraine, the war, the voices drowned out by privilege. But a shadow of doubt crept in. The viral fame cut both ways. His message was spreading, yet threats clogged his inbox, and even some supporters questioned his tactics. "You're making it about you," one had written. He clenched his fists, shoving the doubt down. No, this was bigger than him. Barron's words had hit a raw nerve, and he'd wieled that pain to force the world to listen. The clock ticked closer to noon. His audience waited, hungry for more. He'd give it to them, and if Barron dared to show his face again, so much the better. Barron slipped out the estate's side door, gravel crunching under his sneakers as he dodged the security team's watchful eyes. He needed to breathe, to escape the suffocating walls and his mother's caution. The air was sharp, the sky a brittle blue, but the calm felt like a lie, like it could crack open at any moment. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. He reached the wrought iron gates, hands shoved in his hoodie pockets, breath fogging in the chill. The city's distant buzz called to him, a reminder of the chaos beyond these walls. He gripped the gate's bars, staring out when a figure across the street caught his eye, a man half shielded by a tree, fedora shadowing his face. Barron's pulse spiked. It was the same stranger from the bookstore, the one who'd clapped and warned him of consequences. The man stood still, hands in his coat pockets, watching. Curiosity battled wariness. Barron glanced back. No one from the estate had noticed. With a quick exhale, he pushed through the gate and crossed the street, strides bold despite the knot in his gut. The stranger didn't budge, his half-smile flickering as Barron approached. "You again," Barron said, stopping a few feet away. "Who are you?" "Just a concerned citizen," the man rasped, voice rough like gravel. "Caught your little showdown, thought you might need a heads-up." Barron's eyes narrowed. A heads-up from some guy creeping outside my house. The stranger chuckled, low and dry. "Fair, but you're in over your head, kid. That Zelensky fan, he's not alone. He's got people behind him, people who'd love to see your family bleed. You stirred the pot and now it's boiling." Barron's stomach lurched, the words mirroring Melania's warning. "What do you know about it?" "Enough to say you're a target now," the man said, his tone darkening. "This isn't just about Ukraine or your dad. It's personal for him and others. You're a symbol, like it or not." "I'm not a symbol," Barron shot back, fists balling. "I'm a person." The stranger's smile vanished, his gaze cold. "Tell that to the mob, they don't see the difference." He stepped closer, voice dropping. "You've got two roads, Barron, double down or vanish. Anything in between, they'll chew you up." Before Barron could answer, the man tipped his hat and slipped away, blending into the street's shadows. Barron stood rooted, the stranger's words coiling around him like smoke. Warning or threat? He couldn't tell. His phone buzzed, jolting him back. A text from Eric. "Dimitri's live stream just started. He's calling you out again." Barron's grip tightened, heart pounding. Double down or vanish. He glanced at the estate, then toward the city, where Dimitri's voice was already rippling through the airwaves. The choice loomed, but time was running out. The wind picked up, swirling the fallen leaves around Barron's feet as he sat on the park bench, his phone still warm in his hand from the call. The screen glowed faintly, now displaying a news alert. Activist calls for protest at Trump estate after explosive live stream. The headline was accompanied by a still of Dimitri, his fist raised, the cracked phone glinting like a battle scar. Barron's chest tightened. The world was moving fast, too fast, and he was caught in its current. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the best way to fight is to listen. It was maddeningly vague, yet it had sparked something in him, a flicker of resolve amid the chaos. He couldn't just sit back and let Dimitri's narrative take over. But charging into the fray, fists swinging, wasn't the answer either. The debate was his compromise, his way of stepping into the ring without throwing a punch. A jogger slowed nearby, glancing at him curiously before moving on. Barron pulled his hood tighter around his face, suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. The park, once a quiet refuge, now felt like a stage, every rustling branch a potential spotlight. He wondered how long it would take for the message to reach Dmitri, and what the response would be. Meanwhile, across town, Dmitri slumped into a chair, the adrenaline from the live stream draining out of him like water from a cracked dam. His apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the reality of his actions sank in. The chat window on his laptop was still open, a flood of comments scrolling past, some praising his courage, others calling him a fool. One stood out, bolded in all caps, "You've gone too far this time." He stared at it, a knot forming in his stomach. The cracked phone sat on the desk, its screen dark now, a silent witness to his outburst. He'd meant every word he'd said, every accusation he'd hurled at Barron and the Trump legacy. But now, with the stream over and the call for protest ringing in the air, doubt crept in. What if it wasn't enough? What if it backfired? His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Alexei, a friend who straddled the line between their worlds, a Ukrainian immigrant who'd once interned at a Trump-affiliated charity. Dmitri frowned, opening the message. "Alexei, Barron just called me. He wants a debate. Public live-streamed, says you pick the time and place. What do I tell him?" Dmitri's breath caught. A debate? He reread the text, his mind racing. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd braced for silence, for security barricades, maybe even a lawsuit. But a debate? Barron was stepping into the fire willingly. It was bold, almost reckless, and it threw Dmitri off balance. He stood, packing again, the carpet groaning under his boots. Part of him wanted to laugh it off, to call it a publicity stunt. Barron Trump, the sheltered heir, trying to play the hero. It was absurd. But another part of him, the part that had read his cousin's letters until the words blurred, saw an opportunity. A debate wasn't just a platform, it was a battlefield. If he could face Barron head-on, strip away the polish and privilege, he could win more than a protest ever could. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, then tapped out a reply. "Dmitri, tell him yes. Tomorrow 3 p.m. outside the bookstore where it started. Neutral ground. We'll stream it on my channel." He hit send, his pulse pounding in his ears. Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours to prepare. He'd have to cancel the protest or redirect it. The bookstore was public, symbolic, a place where their story had begun. It was perfect. Back at the park, Barron's phone buzzed again. Another call from the mutual contact. He answered, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "Yeah." "He's in," Alexei said, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "Tomorrow, 3 p.m. outside the bookstore. He wants to stream it on his channel. You sure about this, Barron?" Barron exhaled, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I'm sure. Thanks for making it happen." He hung up, the reality of it settling over him like a heavy coat. Tomorrow he'd face Dmitri, not with fists or guards, but with words. It was a risk, exposing himself like that, letting Dmitri set the stage. But it was his move, his chance to take control of the story. The news alert on his phone updated. Protests planned at Trump Estate tomorrow, he frowned. Dmitri hadn't called them off yet. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe this was a trap, a way to double down, protest in the morning, debate in the afternoon. Barron's jaw tightened. If that was the game, he'd play it. He'd show up regardless. A shadow moved across the grass and he tensed, half expecting the stranger again. But it was just a cloud passing over the sun, the light shifting through the trees. He stood, pocketing his phone, and started walking. He needed to get home, to think, to prepare. The debate wasn't just about Dmitri, it was about him too, about who he was and who he wanted to be. As he left the park, the wind carried the sound of distant traffic, a hum that blended with the rustling leaves. Somewhere out there, Dmitri was plotting his next move. And tomorrow, outside that bookstore, their worlds would collide again, this time with the whole world watching. The stage shuddered as the protesters pressed closer, their voices a deafening roar that drowned out the moderator's pleas for calm. "No more Trumps, no more lies," they chanted, fists pumping the air, Ukrainian flags snapping in the wind alongside signs defaced with Barron's image. The crowd was a sea of motion, some onlookers retreating, others surging forward, phones aloft to capture the unraveling spectacle. Barron's security team tightened their cordon, their shoulders forming a human wall between him and the chaos. His pulse raced, eyes darting from the protesters to Dmitry, who stood frozen at his podium, his face a mask of shock and fury. The debate had been their battlefield, but this was something else entirely. "Get him out of here," one of the guards barked, gripping Barron's arm, but Barron shook him off, his jaw set. "I'm not running," he snapped, his voice barely audible over the din. He turned back to Dmitry, who hadn't moved, his hand still clutching the podium as if it could anchor him against the storm. "Dmitry," Barron shouted, stepping forward despite the guards' protests. "This wasn't the plan, was it?" Dmitry's head jerked up, his eyes blazing. "You think I planned this?" he yelled back, his voice cracking. "This is what happens when people like you don't listen, when you pretend the world's problems don't touch you." The accusation stung, but before Barron could respond, a protester broke through the line, a young woman with a megaphone, her face streaked with blue and yellow paint. "You're a coward, Trump," she screamed, hurling a crumpled flyer that fluttered harmlessly to the ground. The guards lunged, pinning her arms, but her words ignited the crowd further, their chants swelling into a thunderous wave. Dmitry's expression shifted, anger giving way to something like fear. He stepped back, his gaze sweeping the chaos, then landing on the stranger at the crowd's edge. The man in the fedora stood apart, his smirk unchanged, hands in his pockets as if he were watching a play unfold. Dmitry's breath hitched. He knew that face, had seen it before, lurking at the fringes of his protests, always watching, never speaking. "Who the hell are you?" Dmitry shouted, pointing at the stranger, his voice cutting through the noise. The stranger tipped his hat slightly, his grin widening, but he didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, a subtle gesture, and the protesters seemed to surge with renewed vigor, as if responding to an unseen signal. Barron caught the motion too, his stomach twisting. This wasn't random, it was orchestrated. "Dmitry, look," Barron began, but a loud crack split the air, sharp and unmistakable. A firecracker or something worse. The crowd screamed, scattering in all directions, some dropping to the ground, others shoving past security. The stage tilted as someone rammed into its base, the podiums wobbling precariously. "Barron, now," his lead guard roared, no longer asking. Strong hands seized his shoulders, dragging him toward the SUV as the chaos swallowed the scene. Barron resisted, craning his neck to see Dmitry, who was being pulled off the stage by Alexei, his friend's face pale with panic. "Let me go," Dmitry yelled, struggling against Alexei's grip, his eyes locked on the stranger, who was already melting into the fleeing crowd, his fedora a fleeting shadow. The SUV's door slammed open, and Barron was shoved inside, the tinted windows muffling the pandemonium outside. His chest heaved, adrenaline flooding his veins as he pressed his face to the glass. Through the blur of bodies, he saw Dmitry break free from Alexei, charging toward where the stranger had vanished, only to be swallowed by the tide of protesters and police now flooding the street. The vehicle lurched forward, tires squealing as it peeled away from the curb. Barron's phone buzzed again, another text from his mother. "Are you safe?" He stared at it, fingers trembling, unable to type a reply. Safe, he didn't know anymore. Across town, the live stream flickered on thousands of screens, the comments section a whirlwind of shock and speculation. "Did you see that guy in the hat?" one viewer typed. "This is bigger than Barron and Dmitry," another replied. The view count ticked upward, past 1 million, as clips of the debate's collapse spread like wildfire. In a dimly lit room, the stranger settled into a chair, tossing his fedora onto a cluttered desk. A laptop glowed before him, displaying the live feed, frozen on a frame of Barron and Dmitry mid-shout, the crowd erupting behind them. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, a low chuckle escaping his lips. Perfect, he murmured, his voice smooth as silk. He reached for a burner phone, dialing a number from memory. It rang once before a voice answered, crisp and expectant. "It's done," the stranger said. "They're rattled, both of them." "Good," the voice replied, cold and deliberate. "Keep pushing. We're just getting started." The call ended with a click, and the stranger turned back to the screen, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. Outside, the city hummed with the aftermath, sirens wailing, news vans converging, the echoes of the debate reverberating far beyond the bookstore's shattered calm. Barron and Dmitri thought this was their fight. They had no idea how wrong they were. The city skyline glittered against the night, its lights a jagged constellation that seemed to mock the turmoil simmering below. Barron Trump sat in the backseat of the SUV, his breath fogging the tinted window as the vehicle sped through Washington streets, leaving the bookstore's chaos in its wake. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white against the dark fabric of his hoodie, the echoes of the crowd's roars still ringing in his ears. The firecracker's sharp crack replayed in his mind, a jolt that had shattered the debate and thrust him back into the suffocating grip of his family's security. He pressed his forehead to the glass, watching the blurred silhouettes of buildings streak past, each one a reminder of how far this had spiraled beyond his control. The SUV slowed as it approached the Trump estate, its wrought iron gates looming like a fortress against the night. Barron's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, texts from his brothers, alerts from news apps, a flood of mentions on X, but he ignored it. He didn't need to see the headlines to know what they'd say. Debate disaster. Barron Trump flees as protests erupt. The narrative was already hardening, painting him as the retreating heir, the privileged kid out of his depth. His stomach twisted with a mix of anger and resolve. He hadn't fled, he'd been dragged away, but the truth didn't matter now. Perception did. The gates swung open, and the SUV rolled onto the gravel drive, the crunch beneath the tires a stark contrast to the silence inside. As the vehicle stopped, Barron shoved the door open before the guards could, stepping out into the cool air. The estate's windows glowed faintly, a beacon of safety he no longer trusted. His mother's silhouette appeared at the entrance, her arms crossed, her face unreadable in the dim light. She moved toward him, her heels clicking with purpose, but Barron raised a hand, halting her. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He brushed past her, needing space, needing to think. The foyer swallowed him as he entered, its marble expanse cold and echoing. He sank onto the stairs, elbows on his knees, and finally pulled out his phone. The live stream's aftermath dominated the screen, clips of the crowd surging, Dmitri's podium tipping, the stranger's fleeting figure vanishing into the chaos. Barron's jaw tightened. That man, whoever he was, had orchestrated this, turned their debate into a powder keg and lit the fuse. He scrolled through X, the hashtags Bookstore debacle and Trump vs Volkov trending worldwide. The comments were a war zone. Barron's a disgrace, running from a real fight, one read. Dmitri's a hero for standing up, countered another. A third caught his eye, this isn't over, watch the shadows. The cryptic warning sent a chill down his spine, echoing the stranger's earlier words. Barron's fingers hovered over the screen, itching to respond, to fight back, but he stopped. Words wouldn't fix this, not now. Miles away, Dmitri stumbled into an alley near the bookstore, his boots scuffing the wet pavement, his breath ragged from the chase. The protesters had dispersed, scattered by police batons and tear gas, leaving the street eerily quiet save for the distant wail of sirens. His hands shook as he leaned against a brick wall, the Ukrainian flag pin on his jacket glinting faintly under a flickering street lamp. Alexei had tried to pull him back, to get him out before the arrest started, but Dmitri had broken free, driven by a single-minded need to find the stranger. He'd lost him in the crowd, the fedora vanishing like smoke, but the man's presence lingered, a specter that turned Dmitri's victory into ash. The debate was supposed to be his moment, a chance to strip Barron bare before the world, but it had crumbled into chaos, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been played. His cracked phone was gone, lost in the melee, but the live stream's echoes haunted him. Millions had watched, his followers, his detractors, his family back in Ukraine, and what had they seen? Not truth, not justice, but a circus. Dmitri slid to the ground, his back against the wall, the damp seeping through his jeans. His cousin's letters burned in his memory, her pleas for hope, for help, and he clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to amplify her voice to make the world care, but now he wondered if he'd only drowned it out. The stranger's smirk flashed in his mind, that subtle hand gesture igniting the crowd. Who was he? A provocateur, a puppet master. Dmitri's resolve hardened, a ember glowing in the dark. He'd find out, and he'd make Barron face the reckoning they'd both been denied. In a nondescript office across the city, the stranger sat at a desk, the glow of multiple screens bathing his face in cold light. The fedora rested on a hook by the door, revealing a shock of graying hair and a face etched with lines of experience or calculation. One screen looped the debate's collapse, another tracked X's trending topics, and a third displayed a map with blinking dots, locations tied to the protest's key players, including Barron and Dmitri. He leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips, satisfaction radiating from his relaxed posture. The burner phone buzzed beside him, and he answered without hesitation. "It's moving," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. The kids rattled, the activists off balance, the crowds doing the rest. "Good," came the reply, crisp and authoritative, the same voice from before. "Push the narrative, Barron's weakness, Dmitri's instability. Let it fester." The stranger nodded, though the caller couldn't see it. "And the next phase?" "Patience," the voice said. "They'll tear each other apart first, then we step in." The call ended and the stranger turned back to the screens, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the desk. He zoomed in on a still frame, Barron's defiant stance, Dmitri's outstretched arm, the crowd a blur behind them. This wasn't about Ukraine or the Trumps, not really. It was about power, chaos, and the cracks they could widen. He'd been at this game for years, stoking fires, toppling kings, and these two were just the latest pawns. Back at the estate, Barron stood, packing the foyer, his mind a storm of questions. The stranger's shadow loomed larger now, a thread he couldn't unravel. He stopped at the window, staring out at the dark grounds, the gates a barrier that felt more like a cage. His mother's footsteps approached again, softer this time, and he turned to face her. "Barron," Melania said, her voice steady but laced with concern. "You can't fix this tonight. Rest. We'll figure it out tomorrow." He nodded, though rest felt impossible. "I'm not backing down," he said, more to himself than to her. "Whoever's behind this, they don't get to win." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. She squeezed his shoulder and left him there, the silence settling like dust. Barron's gaze drifted to his phone, the screen lighting up with a new alert. Mystery figure spotted at debate, chaos, conspiracy theories explode. His breath caught. The stranger was out there, and the world was starting to notice. In the alley, Dmitri rose, brushing the damp from his jeans, his eyes narrowing with purpose. He didn't have his phone, didn't have a plan, but he had his will, and that was enough. He stepped back into the street, the city's pulse thrumming around him, a vow forming in his chest. Barron wasn't the enemy, not entirely, but someone was pulling strings, and Dmitri would cut them. The night deepened, the city a restless beast holding its breath. Barron and Dmitri, miles apart, stood at their own crossroads, neither defeated, neither victorious, both caught in a web they couldn't yet see. The stranger watched from his perch, the screens flickering like stars, his game far from over. The bookstore standoff had ignited a fire, and now it burned unchecked, its flames licking at the edges of a world ready to fracture. And in the shadows, the next move waited. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.